Well, I want to welcome everybody to the Caspian Policy Center's Forum on Economic Freedom in the Caspian region. We have three very distinguished panelists that will be discussing their thoughts on what can be done to improve the economic climate in the region to further trade and investment. So what I like to say is business is like water. It has a tendency to take the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance is the most economical, and the most economical provides profit, and that provides a boost to the economy. So when we look at those types of things, look at the barriers that prevent business from flowing, and where those barriers have been removed and economic freedom is obtained, the economy has a tendency to flourish. So with that, I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists, Ambassador Retired Terry Miller, Anthony Kim, both with the Heritage Foundation, as well as retired Ambassador Alan Mustard, who is also a Caspian Policy Center Senior Fellow. So I appreciate that. I will let Ambassador Miller start off with his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Admiral. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here today in this event, and I look forward to the discussion that we have going forward. I want to start by just describing a little bit about the data set upon which I'll be basing my remarks, which is the Index of Economic Freedom. If we could have the first slide. I just want to explain a little bit about what the index is and how we measure what we measure. And that puts a little context into the discussion. In the Index of Economic Freedom, we're looking at almost 180 countries around the world, including really all the countries in the Caspian region. And we're examining about 45, 50 different data points for each country. And we turn this into an index by grouping the data in 12 broad categories. And those are things like business freedom, labor freedom, the rule of law, the size of government, or openness to the world economy, openness to investment flows and trade flows. So it's a very broad snapshot, if you will, of economic conditions in each country. And we found that the results are significantly correlated with some very positive benefits for countries. Now the next slide, please. Just a little bit more context, because we're coming through an extraordinary year. And obviously, COVID-19 has had a tremendous impact in many, many countries around the world. And 155 out of the 180 countries that we look at experienced negative economic growth in 2020. And one of the things that we have to try to do is to discriminate between or discern what impact our economic freedom factors, the policy factors that have been applied have, and just what's the overall impact on the data of this global world decline in economic activity that we've seen. So in some respects, we're relying on time series data that goes back as much as 25, 27 years to base our correlations and our conclusions about the impact of economic freedom in general. But we're also trying to look at what's happened during the last year specifically, and then that points to some policy decisions that countries might make to improve their outcomes. Next slide. You can see in this triple graph that the index scores have gone up significantly over the life of our index. It's 27 years. And that's about an 8% rise in global economic freedom over that time. And what you've seen is that global GDP has more than doubled during that period. So that's a very positive outcome for the world economy. But even perhaps more significant, you see on the right-hand side there that poverty has dropped, well, more than 2/3. Severe poverty rates have dropped around the world. So this globalized world economy that we've been experiencing has done an amazing job in terms of improving the livelihoods of ordinary people around the world. And that's true in the Caspian region too. Next slide, please. Now, how do we know that it's significant that economic freedom's gone up and the world economy has risen as well? Well, we've looked over time at the relationship between economic freedom scores and income, per capita income. And you can see that there's a very nice positive correlation there, and that as economic freedom rises, income rises. So we're very confident that this relationship is a strong and positive one. Next slide. It's also true that it's not just the level of economic freedom that matters. It matters whether economic freedom is increasing or decreasing. And there's a very positive correlation between increasing economic freedom and economic growth rates. So we're looking at the change in economic freedom and the change in income, in effect. There, and those are also highly correlated, and it doesn't matter over what time period in our data we look at, that relationship again is there and strongly positive. Next slide. This matters not just for income or wealth, but it matters for other things that are very important to people's lives. As economic freedom rises, you get better health care, better health outcomes, longer lives, you get better access to education, and you get cleaner environments, really in all the countries we've looked at. Next slide. Looking at the results for this year, this is the top 20. Well, actually, it's 21. I don't know how Sweden crept in there, but there they are. And I put this slide up just to show that there is one country from the Caspian region, Georgia, at number 12, represented in the top 20. So that's a very positive outcome. Next slide. Here are the rankings for all of the countries in the Caspian region. Georgia 12, Armenia 32nd place, Kazakhstan 34, Azerbaijan 38. Those 4 countries are all what we would consider, based on the index results, as mostly free economies. And that's quite a positive outcome. And then you see the other 4 countries at various stages of development in terms of economic freedom and also overall economic development. Next slide. I put this up. This is the worldwide results for countries that have gained. We all had a few that lost economic freedom, but many gained economic freedom during the year. The countries of the Caspian region that we're considering fall into 2 of our regions in the index of economic freedom. So if you look at the Asia Pacific region there, you see that Tajikistan and Kazakhstan both show up as among the top gainers in economic freedom for the past year. And if you look at Europe, you see Armenia listed there. So they also had a very good result. Next slide, please. In fact, here are the changes for the 8 countries that we're looking at today. You can see they all had increases in economic freedom, and that's an amazing result. I don't think there's any other significant grouping of countries that I could have put up from our worldwide results that would have every single country gaining in economic freedom, and some like Tajikistan, there were very significant gains. Next slide. Even more important than what's happened this last year is what's happened over the life of our index. And these results are just incredible. When you look at the increase, this would be over a 25-year period, basically. In economic freedom, look at those scores for Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan, and Uzbekistan now as well. This is just incredible improvements in economic policy that have taken place in these countries. And it's going to put them in a very powerful position to experience economic growth and increases in prosperity going forward. Next slide. I just want to drill down a little bit on our results on one particular category. These are the 12 basic areas we look at in the index. And I want to really focus on the rule of law aspects here, because that's an area where the countries in the Caspian region generally have a lot of work still to do. We're talking about property rights, judicial effectiveness, and particularly government integrity. So this is the area of the index where we look at corruption, honesty, access to fair and impartial redress for grievances. And this is an area where the countries in the Caspian are perhaps not doing quite as well as they otherwise might. Next slide. Here are the scores for the rule of law for each of these countries, the average scores. You can see they range from 63 in Georgia, which is a pretty good score, down to just 23.2 in Turkmenistan. And I put the European average here on the screen for comparison. The countries of Europe average 65.4. That's a 65 out of 100, basically, on this. So that means many, many countries in Europe have scores in the 70s or 80s on these indicators. And you can see that the Caspian region falls significantly below that. So if I were advising these countries on where to focus their efforts, it'll be no surprise. Focus on the fight against corruption, focus on providing equal and fair access and timely access to the justice system, and focus on ensuring that property rights exist so that you have a very solid underpinning for private economic activity. And I'm not sure I have one more slide or not. Let's see what the next slide. No, this is the point where we're going to turn the discussion over to my colleague, Anthony Kim. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I must say that this is a very special Wednesday, one of those April Wednesday in 2021, because how many times can you be surrounded by two ambassadors, one admiral and one Asian American, hosted by Caspian Policy Center, thanks to Afghan and Akbato. So I'm just delighted to be here with you all to have this discussion. And also, as I understand, our friends in Baku and in Caspian region, they are also watching us. So let me fix my tie a little bit as well. So echoing Ambassador's point, I'm going to sort of talk more about Azerbaijan and emerging role that Azerbaijan has been playing and will be playing. And I really like the initial comment, introductory remark by Admiral. As Admiral, he used water analogy, business flow, investment flow. The best way we make good things happen is like organically, naturally, good things coming to the good destination. People can be happy and richer and all good happiness. So that's the exact concept we are trying to promote through our annual Index of Economic Freedom as well. Let me dive into my first slide on Azerbaijan. This is a basically snapshot the latest assessment by the Heritage Foundation through the Index of Economic Freedom, where Azerbaijan is in terms of its global competitiveness concerning business environment. It's really not bad. It's quite impressive. Azerbaijan stands 38th freest economy in our 2021 Index of Economic Freedom as a mostly free economy. I think this is the first time Azerbaijan got to this status of economic freedom. Previously, the score of Azerbaijan was below 70, but now, as you can see, the score is 70.1 above 70 benchmark. So that means Azerbaijan is one of those emerging mostly free economy according to our annual Index of Economic Freedom. This is a very positive, welcome news, especially concerning the ongoing pandemic and then uncertainty induced by it. Next slide, please. And reiterating what I said, if you look at the trend line, it's everything we talk about is, in fact, it comes down to trend. Is it positive, negative, going forward or backward? Clearly, without any exaggeration, you see the positive upward slope of Azerbaijan's economic freedom. This is once again a point and fact that we want to highlight, because the direction of Azerbaijan is very clear. This is upward and positive and forward-looking. We are not saying the country doesn't have any problems. Every country has problems, but Azerbaijan obviously recognizing the problem and moving forward and upward. And this is a point, this is the entry point for greater policy discussions we will have today and going forward. And next slide, please. And specifically, as Ambassador mentioned, globally and also in the Caspian Center, kind of lagging indicator, lagging pillars of economic freedom happens to be rule of law. And if we dive into Azerbaijan's indicators, you see a lot of greenish and bright colors, but we see some red color-ish in the rule of law area. So again, that's where we want to probably focus on in terms of really elevating a greater institutional capacity in terms of making the economy of Azerbaijan more open, transparent, and even accountable, so that entrepreneurial opportunities can really arise out of this competitiveness. I mean, if you look at open markets and regulatory efficiency, it's very competitive. And once again, Azerbaijan has been moving towards the right direction, but more can be done, obviously, in the rule of law area, as in many other countries in the region and around the globe. And we also recognize the sort of the challenge and the complicated dimensions concerning the rule of law and how to really improve overall rule of law in the areas of property rights, judicial matters, and a lot of trust in government. So we recognize the problem and challenging situation. Nonetheless, this has to be addressed as we go. Next slide, please. Now, this is one of my prime slides for this discussion we have today. I mean, if you look at the 8 countries in the Caspian Center, you see right there, Azerbaijan, green color, in the middle. This is my main point. I think in terms of economic freedom discussion and also going forward, what really matters is economic freedom in the Caspian region, because it's only one country, can do better than the others, but overall, we need a regional elevation in terms of greater business environment, because to make good things happen, we have to elevate everybody's competitiveness and overall good business climate. In that setting, I happen to believe Azerbaijan, it has a unique role to play in terms of connecting all the different players and stakeholders in the region. And it happens to be Azerbaijan is in the middle, according to our 21 Index of Economic Freedom. I think the ongoing great trade and investment relationship with Georgia and Kazakhstan, that should be further encouraged, while Azerbaijan can team up with the countries like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan to elevate their overall economic competitiveness and business environment through constructive and forward-looking policy discussions. It's notable that Uzbekistan has been improving its overall economic freedom as well, quite impressively over the past 3 years. Turkmenistan, obviously, it's still shy about injecting greater momentum for reform, but I think that the overall direction for the region, despite uncertainty and challenging situation, I think it's quite cautiously optimistic. And thus, once again, I want to emphasize the unique role that Azerbaijan can play in coming years. Now, this leads to my last point. I think this totally unexpected, unpleasant, even unacceptable pandemic we are facing. Now it's been over a year. I think over the past year and let's say year and a half, we have seen basically 3 negatives. What I mean by those 3 negatives in the context of economic freedom and overall economic policy environments. The first one is immediate negatives. Pandemic, who knew it's going to come to us? So this really shocked everybody, business community, policy making circle. This was really life and death, kind of a big question in the very beginning. But now, as we've been through certain stages of this pandemic, this ongoing pandemic, we are now dealing with, at least from my perspective, neutralized negatives and delayed negatives. These 2 negatives, unlike immediate negatives, we can exercise certain control in terms of minimizing the negative impact of this pandemic. I think these 2 negatives, neutralized and delayed negatives, they are the ones we can convert them into opportunities, future opportunities. So for Azerbaijan, if I may, the implication for the country and for the Caspian region is very straightforward. Let's continue this ongoing reform effort more than ever. I mean, it's one thing that you can celebrate Azerbaijan is one of the mostly free economy, but you really have to bring concrete, measurable, real investment into the region and into the country. So regional connectivity is important, led by Azerbaijan, perhaps Georgia, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. And the good news is that oil price will be, in a way, helping this new chapter of the global economy. So you will have a certain fiscal cushion, but that's not for just the spending. What you need to do is a bit more committed and strategic thinking in terms of elevating further Azerbaijan's overall economic freedom. So that's the setting we are in, and I'm sure that we'll have a cons and pros concerning what to do and how to do. So this is not the first time or the silver bullet discussion we're going to have. This is just the beginning of greater discussions we'll have in coming months and years. Hopefully, not only in DC but also in Baku and Tbilisi and other parts of the region, so that we can really elevate this prosperity in the region. And I'm sure, once again, Azerbaijan has a unique role to play. And I believe that's why we are doing this discussion this morning. So thank you. And then I look forward to our Q&A session.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. And we have 2 Asian Americans in the room. So with that being said, thank you for those remarks. And I wrote many notes down, and now I have many questions. But before that, I'll pass over the mic to Ambassador Mustard for his remarks.
Thank you, Admiral. I'm going to take a slightly different tack and will extract from the Heritage Foundation's excellent report and analysis the 2 extremes, Turkmenistan at number 167 on the list and Georgia at number 12 on the list, and then contrast them. Now, a bit of a caveat, Turkmenistan statistics are still compiled on the basis of old Soviet models, whereas Georgia has very much shifted to more Western models of statistical compilation. So it's difficult to compare them straight across with each other. But nevertheless, I'm going to present some examples of data that give you a sense of how those two countries at the extremes of the Heritage Foundation's analysis, how they differ. One of the things I looked at was land use. Land use is a strong indicator of freedom. And if you've studied American history, you remember Thomas Jefferson's admonition that he wanted to see America populated by yeoman farmers who would be economically independent, because a farmer who owns his own land is not beholden to the government and will vote the way he wants to vote in elections, not because the government told him to vote in a particular way. So if we look at the difference between Turkmenistan and Georgia in terms of ownership of agricultural land, in Turkmenistan, 100% of all land, not just agricultural land, but all land belongs to the government, just as in Soviet times. Arable land is about 1.4 million hectares, and slightly less than 95% of the arable land, which is land that you can plow, on which you can produce field crops, basically is operated by rebranded collective and state farms. They now call them peasant associations, but they are really operated in much the same way that collective and state farms were under the Soviet Union. Equipment and inputs are provided by the government on terms similar to those of the Soviet Union, with production quotas and assigned commodities. Now, if you contrast that with Georgia, Georgia quickly abolished its collective and state farms. They had roughly 1,300 of them and shifted over to private farming. And private farmers now own 70% of arable land and produce 85% of the wheat, 99% of the beans, and 98% of fruits. Private ownership of land is protected by law in Georgia. Farmers make their own production decisions. And Georgian agriculture, let's be clear, suffers from a lot of problems, including low productivity and gross undercapitalization, but it's dominated by private smallholders who enjoy the freedom to make their own production decisions. If you look at industry, in Turkmenistan, at least 73% of industrial turnover in 2019 was in the hydrocarbon extraction and processing sector, plus electrical power generation and production of textiles, construction materials, and chemicals. These industries are totally in the state sector. Now, this figure of 73% is probably an underestimate for state participation in the industrial economy, because Turkmen statistics do not offer breakouts between public versus private construction. And last January, the government claimed 2,500 large-scale projects under construction at a cost of $37 billion. Now, examples of this include a $1.5 billion new city being built as the new capital of Ahal province, a $1.5 billion price tag of 5 construction projects on Chandabil Avenue in Ashgabat, the country's capital. And I would guess that, in fact, well over three quarters of industrial turnover is in the state sector in Turkmenistan, with some food processing, some ready-made garment production, and other light industries in the private sector. Now, if we look at Georgia by contrast, Georgia provides statistics that break out the state versus the private sector. And if you look at the numbers of businesses as well as turnover, you get a totally different picture. Out of 723,000 businesses in Georgia in 2019, 99.8% are privately owned. Only 0.2% of businesses belong to a government entity. And out of the turnover, as measured in Georgian lari, 97.4% of turnover was in the private sector versus 2.6% in the government sector, a huge difference. Now let's turn to capital, because capital flows also give you an indication of freedom. If capital flows go, as Admiral McLaren put it, like water, flowing where they need to flow rather than being directed by the government. Superficially, the banking sectors look very similar between Turkmenistan and Georgia. Turkmenistan has 11 banks, Georgia has 15 banks. Turkmenistan has one bank that is a joint venture with a Turkish bank, between a Turkish and Turkmenistan banks. 2 foreign banks, National Bank of Pakistan and Iran Saderat, plus 8 indigenous Turkmen banks split half and half between government and commercial, with 147 branches among them. Georgia has 14 banks with foreign capital participation and 149 branches. They sound very similar. But then let's look at where the money flows. In 2020, 91% of the value of Turkmenistan's bank loans were issued by the government-owned banks. In 2021, that percentage dropped to 80% because one of the government banks was formally privatized. But are these banks really private? The truth is that even in so-called commercial banks, the ownership is with the government, and the leadership is held to account by the president. On February 10th of this year, the president issued formal reprimands for poor performance to all 8 Turkmen bank chairmen plus the chairman of the central bank. And I can't imagine a president of another country that's farther up in the Freedom Index being able to issue reprimands to bank chairmen. In a 2017 report, if we contrast with Georgia, KPMG, the consultancy, characterized the Georgian banking sector this way, quote, "The shareholding structure of the Georgian banks is diverse. There are both resident and non-resident shareholders," unquote. The Georgian banking sector includes both privately owned and state-owned banks, no question, including some branches of foreign state-owned banks, but it pretty clearly operates on commercial terms and not as an arm of the Georgian government. The IMF country report of last December notes, quote, "Performance under the IMF supported program remains satisfactory," unquote. So if the IMF is satisfied with the performance, that indicates that the money is going to places it needs to go. Now, Georgia has its problems. The IMF report describes some needed additional reforms, but government overregulation of the banking sector isn't one of them. So in conclusion, economic freedom is a function of freedom of land ownership, freedom of commerce, freedom of capital, among other things. And where land, commerce, and capital are controlled by a central government, freedom is constrained. And I will turn it back over to you, Admiral. Thank you very much. And thank you to my Heritage colleagues for excellent analysis.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I appreciate all the distinguished panelists' comments. Very, very informative. And we're going to open it up now to two-way conversation and have conversations about some of this stuff to see what ideas that we can do to help formulate change. So with that being said, I wanted to ask the question, and Mr. Kim, this one is specifically for you because you mentioned something that has been on my mind as an issue ever since I first started going to Central Asia and doing business. And that was regional economic freedoms, working as a region. And Ambassador Miller, I agree with everything you said about rules of law. That also plays a very important part in this discussion on business. But the specific issues that I had and still have as I work in the region is there's a saying in business, time is money. And the transportation corridors and the customs bureaucracy flowing through the region are very cumbersome, very time consuming, drive up the cost of labor, drive up the cost of fuel. And in business, nobody wants to go that way if it's going to take that long and with no certainty of when the product is going to arrive at one point or the other. So the question that I have is, and you mentioned Azerbaijan potentially being the middle country to work economic freedom on a regional basis. Are there any indicators that you have to measure economic freedom by region?
Indeed, Admiral, this is why we are having this discussion today, obviously to talk about regional setting concerning regional competitiveness and regional economic freedom. And I think you and I and our panelists, other speakers this morning, we are on the same page. This is not just country, one country only, country specific, one-dimensional discussion. This is really about the region. We can say Caspian region or Central Asia, or even connecting Europe and Asia because of the importance of the Caspian region. And I think that sort of the previous chapter, or let's say movie we have seen since the collapse of Soviet Union, basically, a lot of searching process, source searching, identity searching process. Some countries, they've been moving faster than the others, but countries like Turkmenistan, unfortunately, they are still confined to this old way of thinking, and very much, even 19th century, even longer period. But now, the reality is that we are in the 21st century, and we are going through the third global crisis of the 21st century. We had a 9/11. We had a global financial crisis in 2009. 9/11 was 2001, and now 2020 pandemic. So every 10 years or so, we are getting hit by this global crisis. And that's why, once again, I happen to think that this is a unique momentum that the region as a whole can elevate its overall status as a more attractive business hub or investment destination. Again, I think Ambassador Mustard kind of zoom in terms of specific sector. A lot of shortcomings, homework we need to do together. But I think Azerbaijan, not as a middleman, but because of its unique position in terms of size and potential and its willingness, it can be a great facilitator to move forward the region towards a greater openness and greater economic competitiveness as a region. Because it's not that Turkmenistan alone can achieve whatever greater prosperity for its citizens. It has to work with Uzbekistan, and Uzbekistan, it has to work with Azerbaijan. And Georgia, they have to work with Azerbaijan as well in terms of developing infrastructure and all that. So that's why I think Caspian region is unique, and that's why I happen to think Azerbaijan has a very unique and timely momentum in terms of really exercising its regional leadership even, but it has to be really committed leadership in terms of openness, accountability, and transparency. So we do recognize it's not going to be easy process, but this is something that we very much hope to see Azerbaijan can take a lead on it. And we believe, as you and I, Admiral, as we know, this is something that Azerbaijan is willing to do.
Thank you, Mr. Kim, for that. Before I get to a question for all the panelists, I had a kind of a follow-on question for Ambassador Miller that follows on to that. So you had presented the European average and used that as comparison so that we could see how the differences are for the Caspian region by country versus the European average on economic freedom. Talking on a regional basis, what lessons could the Caspian region take or study or learn from or copy, whatever word you want to choose, by looking at the European model and seeing how they can make changes to better the flow of business in the region?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. The European model, I wouldn't necessarily hold it up as as the greatest thing, because European countries have very large state sectors in many cases that are devoted primarily to large welfare systems. There is some government investment in business, but most European countries have been moving very gradually, I would have to say, over 20, 30, 40 years away from that model towards a model in which private sector predominates. And what we see in terms of, you started out this question by talking about rule of law, and the Caspian region does not perform as well as Europe in that situation, but they are better than some other regions. Latin America, for example, has very low rule of law scores on average, and so does Africa. Asia and Europe and North America, of course, do much better in that regard. And the problem we have is the relationship between the size of government and corruption overall. The larger government is, or the more intrusive government is, the more opportunities there are for corrupt activities, for what we call, what economists call rent-seeking behavior, where businesses are trying to accommodate government rather than trying to accommodate consumers of their products. And that really holds back the development of, it diverts resources, if you will, from the overall development of an economy to the state sector and to individuals in the state sector. And that's the model that we really need to get away from. So when I look at countries, for example, that have had rulership dynasties over a long period of time, that's an invitation to corruption in a society. I want to go back to something Ambassador Mustard said earlier. He was talking about the yeoman farmer. And one of the benefits of economic freedom is that, as is the case with a yeoman farmer, when you have an economically free society, you are empowering individuals who are not part of the government ruling apparatus. You're giving them power in society to stand up to that ruling apparatus and make their own needs and views and desires known within the context of overall societal development. So it's not only that an economically free society benefits from democracy, but an economically free society promotes democracy, because economic freedom is really all about the dispersion of power in society. It's the dispersion of power away from centralized, usually government-controlled enterprises to individuals. And that's really what we're trying to promote in terms of change, not only in the Caspian region, but in all the lesser developed regions of the world.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Ambassador. Let's get to a question for all the panelists from Jeremy Cohen, and I'll read it to you. How durable will the economic policy changes prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic be to long-term economic thinking in the Caspian region? Are these changes temporary, or should we expect to see enduring restrictions on cross-border travel, etc.? And that's to anybody who wants to tackle that question.
You want me to take that one, fellas? I think it's going to vary across the spectrum of what Heritage Foundation has laid out, quite frankly. I think in the case of Georgia, you will see lifting of restrictions very quickly and cascading down to Turkmenistan. I think that Turkmenistan will keep the restrictions in place as long as they remain plausible. So it depends on how open or how closed the society is. I don't think there will be a one size fits all. And I'll turn it over to the other two if they want to comment.
Yeah, if I could jump in there. What we've seen in the case of COVID-19 restrictions are a number of restrictions that seem to be based on the best science related to health. But we've also seen a huge array of restrictions that appear, at least on the surface, to have very little to do with health. And they're really about increasing the power of individual special interests in most cases within society. And to the extent that these restrictions continue to benefit special interests in a society, and obviously there'd be a difference between a country like Turkmenistan and a country like Georgia in that regard, they are likely to endure. So I would think that the purely health-related restrictions will drop away very quickly in every country. But those which are convenient for special interests or elites in society in terms of maintaining their power or influence might endure somewhat longer, particularly in the less democratic countries.
If I may, I'll make two quick observations reinforcing and echoing these 2 points by ambassadors. I hope this is not something controversial, something that I'll say. To me, at least, this whole COVID pandemic, COVID virus, is not just medical, biological virus. It has become economic, social, cultural, even political virus, depending on how you look at it. How each country and how each government around the world, they've been reacting to this. So let's admit that this is not just a pure public health policy crisis. My fear, and I think our proactive action should be how not to make this public health crisis into fiscal crisis and therefore greater economic crisis down the road. Because it's one thing that we have to fight against, this, very, very bad virus, but we cannot sacrifice our future. Future meaning, what I mean by future is our economic future mainly. So I think there has to be a wake-up call or recognition that spending more is not a solution to fight against this virus. We need to really continue our previous journey in terms of reforming our economy. So I think this is really something that I want to emphasize. We should do our homework in terms of not making this public health crisis into a greater economic crisis down the road.
Okay, so going back to the rule of law, this is a question from Brianne Todd, and her question is, aside from the basic U.S. interest / value of supporting the rule of law in the Caspian region, U.S. businesses are constrained by domestic laws like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in ways that foreign businesses, e.g. China National Petroleum Corporation, are not. Even in the countries that have more economic freedom, how do U.S. businesses compete on what is essentially an uneven playing field? And it wasn't directed to anyone in specific, so any of the 3 panelists are welcome to go there.
So, Admiral, if you want me to go first, and then Ambassador Miller and Mr. Kim can correct me afterwards.
Okay.
I want to share, Brianna, an anecdote from when I was serving in Moscow. One of my colleagues in Moscow in another embassy complained to me that bribery didn't really give the companies from his country any sort of advantage. He said, the first time you offer that bribe, you may get the contract, but then in the future, it's just taken as a given that you're going to offer that bribe and be in competition with everybody else offering bribes. So it doesn't really necessarily give you that much of an advantage. It really lets you fall into a trap. And in terms of how U.S. businesses compete, frankly speaking, I didn't find that was a huge problem. I did know of specific instances when a U.S. company could not win a tender or could not get a deal pushed through because it refused to pay a bribe. And I can't go into specifics here for obvious reasons. But to be honest, it was a relatively small part of the overall commercial picture. So I think on balance, fighting corruption is a net positive for the United States. There will be instances when U.S. companies lose out, but they are instances. They are not the broad landscape that companies have to deal with. I'll turn it over to the others.
Yes, I agree with that. And the thing is, U.S. businesses need to reflect the values and principles of the U.S. And these laws are designed to ensure, like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and others are designed to ensure that U.S. businesses live up to and respect U.S. laws and values in all of their dealings around the world. And you know, a corporation is not an entity that can have one set of values when it operates in Turkmenistan, for example, and another set of values when it's operating in the United States. It will have one set of values. And those values, for us, at least in my opinion, need to reflect the values of the United States. And that means a rejection of bribery, a rejection of corruption. And I agree with Ambassador Mustard that this is not as big a problem in actuality as it is sometimes made out to be in the political debate. But the other thing I would say is that American businesses don't have any right to sales in another country. And if they can't compete acting honestly and in accordance with US values in those countries, well, then I guess maybe they need to focus their efforts on business activities in other countries. Or, of course, as overall US policy, a US government, they need to act as ambassadors for our values and try to change or proselytize American values in those countries by showing that they can offer superior goods and services, better delivery of product than the countries that or the companies that rely on bribery. And frankly, in many cases, that is possible for US businesses, and they are able to compete even without participating in the corrupt practices of the host country.
And just quickly, to me, this question is really about why trade and investment relationship matters. Because when we talk about rule of law issue, I mean, in the region, in the Caspian region and Azerbaijan, we are not talking about the same degree of the problem we are seeing in Venezuela. For example, in Venezuela, American companies nowadays, they do not want to go there because they are clearly aware of the huge headache they will have and problem. But in the Caspian region and Azerbaijan, US companies are curious, at least that's my assessment. They want to go in to do some business, but they are not sure yet. They are not convinced about the rule of law and other pillars of economic freedom in Azerbaijan, in the Central Asia. And I think that's why we have this, once again, unique momentum. While US companies are curious, why don't you do some more homework and convince them this is really a good place to do business? And that's where we can link trade and investment relationship, because in the end, trade and investment relationship with Azerbaijan and countries in the Caspian region, it's not just about selling products and buying products. This is also about ideas and exchanging values. And that's where Washington and the United States can play very positive contribution and role. And it's also good to know, and Azerbaijan has a certain orientation, a bit more towards kind of European kind of world, because they want to go into the greater market with a greater openness and eventually, hopefully, greater transparency as well.
Well, thank you, Mr. Kim, for that. You lead into the next question from Ambassador Susan Elliott for all the panelists, and it dovetails right into what you were talking about. Apart from COVID-19 restrictions, do the panelists have suggestions for how to promote trade and economic cooperation among the countries of the region? What is the role for the US? Are there any potential areas for cooperation, collaboration, rather than competition among the US, Russia, and China in the region? How's that?
I'll take a crack at it, Admiral. Um, taking the last question first, yes, there's tremendous opportunities for cooperation among Russia, China, and the United States, starting with the economic side, commercial flows, working together to help Central Asia and the Caucasus countries develop their infrastructure for transportation and communications. In terms of a U.S. role for this, I think the C5+1 has been played a very positive role in Central Asia, to such a degree that Azerbaijan has indicated an interest in making it a C6+1, wanting to join in, as has Afghanistan. So the U.S. clearly has a convening role to bring the countries together to talk about issues that they can solve together. One other issue that I think, or two other issues, I think, where the United States could play a role, as well as Russia and China, in addition to the commercial and economic aspects, which would include customs clearance procedures, some of the mundane bureaucratics of that. Two really large overarching issues are climate change and the impact on the Caspian Sea, particularly the sea level, which will have downstream economic and societal impacts. And of course, the threat of extremism emanating out of Afghanistan, among other places. And these are places where everybody would benefit through closer cooperation. And I'll stop at that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any other thoughts on this, on the subject?
Well, I would just say that it's important that we keep in mind that, sorry, that's my telephone ringing, and I should have turned it off. I think it's important that we bear in mind that governments, including the US government and certainly the others, should have only a marginal role in this. We're a society that believes in free enterprise in the private sector. And when you're talking about development issues, economic issues, it's important that we put the private sector front and center. In that the government can play a convening role, we can highlight certain issues, but if you're having talks between the government of the United States and the government of some country in the Caspian region, they're going to be talking about government things. And in the US context, at least, that should have very little commercial content to it. And the less commercial content we can get the government of the other countries to inject into their discussions, the better that would be. So I get a little bit concerned when we talk about government to government cooperation spilling into the commercial area. It can be a talk about policies, but to the extent that it starts to talk about specific commercial enterprises or activities or investments, I think you're on somewhat dangerous ground there.
Very quickly on this subject, I want to make very concrete recommendation, policy recommendation for our friends in Baku. I think it's time for Azerbaijan really push hard to be a member of the WTO, World Trade Organization. It's been going on, but Azerbaijan is not a member of WTO yet. To me, this accession process concerning WTO can be another constructive venue for Baku and Washington to work together. You know, Georgia, Armenia, they are all members of WTO. Of course, Uzbekistan, they are also pursuing the membership of WTO. But you know, given the new Director General of WTO and the importance of trade in this ongoing pandemic and post-pandemic world, and the desire of Azerbaijan to be the regional trade and investment hub, and then on top of that, this ongoing reform effort can be further demonstrated by Azerbaijan's commitment to become a member of WTO that will enhance at least rule of law part concerning trade and investment. So it's not an easy task, obviously, very complicated process. But I think this is something that, you know, Baku and Washington can think together and even, you know, support each other.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Yeah, I'd just like to jump back in here for a minute because I realize we're getting close to the end. And Anthony mentioned, Mr. Kim mentioned in passing Uzbekistan. And I just wanted to emphasize the importance of Uzbekistan in terms of regional development. Obviously, it has the large population in the region, and it's also a country that has made significant strides in moving away from Soviet kind of economic domination and towards economic freedom, although it still has a long way to go. It's kind of in the middle of the pack, I would say, in terms of economic freedom in the region, but its economic freedom score has improved over 20 points over the life of our index. And I think that's a country that really needs to play more of a leadership role in some ways in the region. And it's a country of great potential. And I just think that we perhaps don't talk quite as much about Uzbekistan compared to some of the other countries in the region as we need to. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now, unfortunately, we have more questions, but we've run to the top of the hour. So I want to thank the panelists for their time and attention and turn it over to final remarks by Efkan.
Thank you, Admiral. Thanks all the speakers that we have today. First of all, I'd like to congratulate both Ambassador Miller and also Anthony for this great new edition of the report. I see that one noticeable aspect for the Caspian region is that, unfortunately, we still have disparity among the countries. We have Georgia ranking and Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan high in the index, and I hope the other countries will catch up. And in that regard, we look forward to see the next year's index and to see how this is going to play out as well. I believe that in the region also people are closely following this index as well. And also for many businesses who wants to learn about the region and investment organizations as well, they keenly follow the report and see what outcomes it will have. And also it highlights the challenges we have, as you mentioned, on the rule of law, property rights, and other questions in the region. And also I would like to thank Ambassador Mustard to making for great remarks on specifically making comparisons between Georgia and Turkmenistan, the high-ranking country in the index, and also the country that has some struggles still, that has a homework to do perhaps. And I believe that we will continue our discussions down the road. Thanks for tuning into the Caspian Policy Center today. And also I'd like to thank Admiral McLaren for moderating this discussion. And we look forward to seeing you in our next events. Again, thanks to our audience in the Caspian region and our audience in the Washington, D.C. and US. We look forward to engaging you in the future as well. Akboda, thanks to you as well, to your team in the Caspian Center. And again, have a great evening. Have a great morning to our colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.